Thomas Kinley, a 74-year-old disabled Marine veteran, walks into his local Texas bank to cash his monthly VA disability check. Teller Haley Morrison, stressed and skeptical, dismisses his documents and tears the check, accusing him of fraud. The bank falls silent as Thomas, humiliated, quietly leaves. Security guard Marcus, a veteran, reports the incident, triggering a swift federal response. Assistant Treasury Secretary Patricia Morales arrives, confronting the bank's negligence. What happens next? Will justice prevail for Thomas? And how will Haley face the consequences of her actions? The story unfolds with unexpected grace and accountability. Support our channel to honor stories like Thomas Kinley's, where dignity triumphs over disrespect. Subscribe to join a community that values veterans' sacrifices and demands justice. Your support helps us uncover truths and amplify voices that deserve to be heard. Stand with us. Subscribe today for values, not titles. Thomas R. Kinley, a retired Marine sergeant, stood at 74 years old with a quiet dignity that belied the tremors in his right hand. Each step he took that morning into the small Texas bank was measured, his stride unbroken despite the weight of years and injuries. He wore a neatly pressed, button-down shirt, its crisp edges a testament to the discipline that still governed his life. On his head sat a faded baseball cap, the word Semper Fi stitched in gold thread, a subtle nod to his past. In his right hand, he gripped a walking stick, its polished wood worn smooth from years of use. Around his left wrist, a medical alert bracelet glinted faintly, a constant reminder of the heart condition that shadowed his days. In his jacket pocket was a check from the Veterans Administration, his monthly disability compensation, a lifeline earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. As he crossed the bank's threshold, the cool air hit his face, but no one noticed him. Not the young couple at the ATM, not the man tapping impatiently at his phone in line, not even the security guard leaning against the wall. Thomas was used to this invisibility. It came with age, with the scars that weren't always visible. He approached the counter, his eyes meeting those of the teller, a woman in her early 30s whose name tag read Haley. She barely glanced up from her computer, her expression pinched, as if the world had already worn her thin that morning. Thomas slid the check across the counter, his fingers steady despite the tremor. Haley picked it up, her eyes flicking over it with a dismissiveness that stung more than it should have. "Where'd you get this?" Her voice was clipped, carrying an edge of suspicion that made Thomas's chest tighten. "It's from the VA," he said calmly, his tone honed by years of diffusing tension in far more dangerous places. "They send it every month." "Do you have proof?" Haley's eyes narrowed, her fingers tapping impatiently on the counter. Thomas reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded document, an official disability verification letter, its red stamps and government seals unmistakable. He smoothed it out carefully, offering it to her with the same patience he'd once shown young recruits under his command. Haley barely glanced at it. "We don't accept loose printouts," she said, her voice flat. "Can't verify authenticity." The words landed like a slap, but Thomas kept his composure, though his heart thudded harder against his ribs. He could feel the bracelet on his wrist, cool against his skin, a warning to stay calm. "I've been coming here for over 20 years, he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of those decades. Same check, same bank every month. Haley's morning had been a storm of frustrations. Her supervisor had chewed her out for slow processing times. Her monthly quotas loomed like a guillotine, and her own financial struggles gnawed at her. A car payment overdue, a looming rent increase. She looked at Thomas and saw not a man who'd served 3 tours, who'd carried shrapnel in his body for decades, but an old man with a check she didn't trust. In her mind, he was another potential fraudster, another headache she didn't need. Her resentment flared, fueled by the unfairness of her own life, by the idea that someone could get money without clocking in every day like she did. "Look," she said, her voice sharpening, "we get people in here all the time trying to cash fake government checks. I can't just take your word for it." Thomas's bracelet caught the fluorescent light as he reached into his jacket again. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he produced his military ID, his VA card, and a letter from his doctor detailing his disability. Each document was a piece of his life, a record of service and sacrifice. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft but firm, I understand you've got to be careful, but I've been banking here since before you were born. Mrs. Patterson, who used to work this counter, she knew me by name. Haley's eyes flicked over the documents, but her mind was already made up. She'd read articles about people faking military service, seen warnings about forged checks. To her, Thomas's papers were just words on a page, easily fabricated. These could all be fake, she said, her tone hardening. Anyone can print official-looking documents these days. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, a faint heat rising in his chest. He took a slow breath, willing his heart to steady. Ma'am, I just need to cash my check. I've done this same transaction here for 20 years. But Haley was beyond reason now, her decision rooted in a mix of stress, bias, and a need to assert control. In a moment she would later replay in her mind with sickening clarity, she took the check in both hands and tore it in half. The sound of the paper ripping was sharp, final. We don't cash checks like this for unemployed people, she said, her voice cold as she dropped the pieces onto the counter. When you have real documentation, come back. The bank went still. The hum of conversation, the rustle of papers, the soft beeps of the eight, all stopped. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint creak of Thomas's walking stick as he shifted his weight. He stared at the torn pieces of his check, each fragment a betrayal of the life he'd given to his country. This wasn't just money, it was his dignity, his survival, his proof of existence. His knee ached as he bent down, slow and deliberate, to pick up the pieces. His disability card, which had slipped from his jacket, lay on the cold tile floor. He retrieved it too, his fingers brushing the embossed letters, Disabled Veteran, USMC. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of their silence pressed against him, as if they too were complicit in this humiliation. Thomas stood, his back straight despite the pain in his joints, and tucked the torn check and card into his pocket. His eyes met Haley's for a brief moment, not with anger, but with a quiet sorrow that cut deeper than any words could. He turned and walked out, each step echoing in the stillness. 5 minutes later, a black SUV with no license plates pulled up outside the bank. The door opened, and a figure stepped out, their presence commanding immediate attention. They walked inside, their voice low but firm. I need the branch manager. Now. Haley stood frozen behind the counter, the torn pieces of Thomas's check still scattered where she'd left them. She didn't yet know the gravity of what she'd done, but a cold dread was beginning to settle in her chest. For Thomas, the walk back to his truck was a journey through a lifetime of battles. Some fought on foreign soil, some fought in moments like this, where the enemy was not a bullet, but a dismissal of his worth. Thomas stood tall, his posture unwavering despite the weight of his cane and the sting of Haley's dismissive words. He didn't shout or argue, his voice remained steady, a quiet resolve anchoring his response. Thank you for your time, ma'am, he said, his eyes locking with hers for a fleeting moment, conveying a depth of restraint that seemed to ripple through the bank's sterile lobby. Then with a measured turn, he made his way to the door, each step deliberate, leaving behind a room full of onlookers whose silence felt heavier than the marble floors beneath them. The air was thick with unease, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed, embedding itself in the memories of everyone present, a scene that would gnaw at their consciences for years. Inside the bank, a middle-aged businessman stood frozen in line, his polished shoes scuffing lightly against the floor as he shifted his weight. He had almost spoken up when he saw the tension escalate, his lips parting for a moment before sealing shut. Something held him back, perhaps the fear of stepping into a conflict that wasn't his, or the assumption that Haley, with her crisp bank uniform and air of authority, knew what she was doing. Now his eyes were glued to his phone, scrolling mindlessly through notifications, avoiding the gazes of those around him. Guilt churned in his gut, a quiet ache for his inaction, for letting a man's dignity be trampled while he stood by, complicit in his silence. At the next teller window, Shra, another bank employee, gripped the edge of her counter, her knuckles whitening. She had seen it all unfold. The way Haley's tone had sharpened, the way Thomas's shoulders stiffened but never slumped. Sarah had cashed Thomas's disability checks countless times when Haley was on break, her fingers familiar with the worn edges of his military ID, the official seal that spoke of sacrifices she could only imagine. She knew Haley was wrong, knew it in her bones, but the thought of confronting her coworker made her stomach twist. Speaking up meant risking the fragile harmony of their workplace, meant stepping into a spotlight she wasn't sure she could handle. So she stayed silent, her heart pounding with the weight of her own cowardice, her eyes darting to the floor as Thomas walked away. Outside, Thomas sank onto the concrete bench by the bank's entrance, the cold seeping through his worn jacket. His hands trembled as he clutched the torn remnants of his disability check, the pieces fluttering slightly in the breeze. It wasn't anger that shook him. It was the bone-deep exhaustion of having his worth questioned, of being reduced to a problem by someone who couldn't begin to grasp what his scars cost him. Each tear in the paper felt like a tear in the pride he'd fought to preserve through decades of service, through battles that left marks both visible and hidden. He stared at the fragments, his mind replaying the encounter, searching for where he might have lost the thread of his own dignity. But Thomas wasn't entirely alone. Marcus Williams, the bank's security guard, stood just inside the glass doors, his eyes tracking Thomas's every move. Marcus, a 26-year veteran of the Army Special Forces, had seen men like Thomas before. Men who carried themselves with a quiet strength that spoke louder than words. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught Marcus to recognize the subtle signs of a soldier's pride. The way Thomas gripped his cane but never leaned on it fully. The way he handled his military ID with reverence, as if it were a sacred relic of a life hard-earned. Marcus had watched Thomas come to the bank every month for years, always polite, always patient, his disability check a testament to sacrifices Haley couldn't fathom. The injustice of what he just witnessed burned in Marcus's chest, a slow, smoldering anger at the disrespect shown to a brother in arms. Without hesitation, Marcus slipped his personal phone from his pocket and dialed a number he'd committed to memory, but hoped he'd never need. "This is Marcus Williams, security at First National, Cedar Street branch," he said, his voice low but firm. "I need to report an incident involving a disabled veteran. It requires immediate attention." On the other end, the response was sharp, professional, demanding details. Marcus didn't flinch. Deliberate humiliation and denial of service to a verified combat veteran. Physical destruction of his VA disability check. Public degradation of his military service. The words felt like a call to arms, each one carrying the weight of Thomas's unspoken pain. "Stand by," came the reply, and Marcus knew the wheels were already turning. Marcus's call set off a chain reaction, swift and unstoppable. Within 2 minutes, the call reached the VA's regional director in Austin, a man who'd spent his career ensuring veterans weren't left to fend for themselves in a world that often forgot them. 3 minutes later, he was on the line with the Federal Treasury Department's Veterans Affairs liaison in Washington, D.C., his voice urgent as he relayed the details. By the 4th minute, Assistant Treasury Secretary Patricia Morales was reading the case file on her secure tablet, stuck in D.C. traffic just outside the Capitol. The words hit her like a punch. Marine veteran, disabled, 23 years of service, disability check destroyed by bank employee. Patricia's father, a Vietnam veteran, had faced similar indignities when he returned home. His sacrifices met with cold bureaucracy. That pain had fueled her career, her rise through the ranks driven by a fierce commitment to ensuring veterans received the respect they were owed, not just in policy but in practice. Her jaw tightened as she made 3 calls in quick succession. First, to her driver, "Turn around, we're going to Austin." Then to the bank's corporate headquarters, her voice cutting through the line like a blade. "This is Assistant Treasury Secretary Morales. You have a situation at your Cedar Street branch that requires immediate executive attention." The third call was to her team, mobilizing them to ensure the response was swift and uncompromising. For Patricia, this wasn't just a case, it was personal, a chance to right a wrong that echoed her father's struggles, and she would not let it pass unanswered. The regional manager of First National Bank, Mr. Henderson, sat in his office, his tie slightly loosened, unaware that his day was about to unravel. His phone rang, piercing the quiet hum of his morning routine. On the other end was Deputy Director Sullivan from the Office of Veterans Affairs, his voice sharp and unyielding. "Mr. Henderson, we have a serious problem at your Cedar Street branch." Sullivan began, his tone carrying the weight of authority. A disabled Marine veteran was denied service, and his government-issued disability check was physically destroyed by one of your employees. Henderson's stomach churned, a cold wave of dread washing over him. His mind raced, searching for any prior knowledge of such an incident, but he came up empty. I wasn't aware of anything like this, he stammered, his voice betraying the panic creeping into his chest. Sullivan's response was curt, leaving no room for excuses. You are now. A Treasury official is already on their way. I strongly suggest you review your security footage immediately and brace yourself for a federal compliance inspection. Henderson's hand trembled as he set the phone down, his mind spiraling. How had this happened under his watch? He pictured the Cedar Street branch, its polished counters and bustling lobby, now tainted by a scandal that could ruin his career. He felt a mix of disbelief and nausea, the kind that comes when you realize you're standing on the edge of a professional cliff. Meanwhile, at the Cedar Street branch, the atmosphere was suffocating. Haley, the young teller who had sparked the incident, tried to focus on her tasks, but her hands shook as she processed transactions. The usual rhythm of the bank, clicking keyboards, murmured conversations, the soft chime of the door, had been replaced by an eerie stillness. Customers cast sidelong glances at her, their whispers like needles pricking her skin. She could feel their judgment, their curiosity about what she'd done. Earlier that morning, she had acted on instinct, convinced she was protecting the bank. The check presented by the veteran, Thomas Kinley, had seemed suspicious, its edges worn, the ink slightly faded. He hadn't provided the kind of proof she'd expected, and in a moment of overzealous caution, she had torn it up. Now the weight of her decision pressed down on her, heavy and unyielding. What she had dismissed as a routine precaution was morphing into something far more serious. Her heart pounded as she replayed the moment in her mind, the way Thomas's face had crumpled, the quiet dignity in his posture giving way to a flicker of hurt. She hadn't meant to humiliate him, but the whispers around her suggested that her actions were being seen in a far harsher light. Janet Coleman, the branch manager, emerged from her office, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. She had sensed the shift in the lobby's energy the moment she stepped out, the unnatural quiet pulling her attention like a siren. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on Haley, whose pale face and rigid posture told her something was terribly wrong. When a coworker quietly filled her in on the incident, Janet's breath caught in her throat, her face drained of color, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She approached Haley, her voice low but laced with urgency. "Haley, do you have any idea what you've done?" she asked, her words trembling with a mix of disbelief and anger. "That man, Thomas Kinley, is a legitimate customer. I know him personally. He's been banking here for over 20 years, long before I even started managing this branch." Haley's throat tightened, her mouth dry as she tried to explain. "The check, it looked suspicious, and he couldn't prove he was a decorated Marine veteran with legitimate VA benefits." Her voice wavered, the excuse sounding flimsier with every word. Janet's eyes widened, her shock giving way to exasperation. "Haley, you didn't just make a mistake. You committed a federal violation of Veteran Services regulations." The words hit Haley like a physical blow, her knees weakening as the gravity of her actions sank in. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear from the prying eyes of customers and coworkers alike. But there was nowhere to hide. At that moment, Marcus, a senior teller with a calm demeanor and a reputation for fairness, approached the two women. His expression was somber, his usual warmth replaced by a quiet intensity. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Janet but glancing at Haley, "you need to know that this incident has already been reported to federal authorities. There are going to be consequences." His words hung in the air, heavy with inevitability. Haley's stomach twisted, a wave of nausea threatening to overwhelm her. She had acted out of what she thought was diligence, but now she saw the ripple effect of her decision, a ripple that was quickly becoming a tidal wave. Through the bank's large front windows, she caught sight of Thomas Kinley still sitting on the bench outside. He looked smaller than she remembered, his shoulders hunched, his hands resting limply on his knees. The sight of him, so quiet and unassuming, stirred a pang of guilt in her chest. Had she really misjudged him so badly? He seemed older now, more fragile, as if the weight of the morning's events had aged him in a matter of hours. As the three bank employees stood frozen in their tense exchange, a black SUV with government plates rolled into the parking lot, its tinted windows gleaming under the morning sun. The vehicle stopped directly in front of the bank's entrance, its presence commanding and ominous. A woman stepped out, her gray business suit crisp and professional, a leather briefcase in one hand. Her face was set in a determined expression, one that suggested she was not here for pleasantries. She paused briefly by Thomas, offering him a respectful nod that carried a quiet acknowledgement of his dignity. Then, with purposeful strides, she pushed through the bank's glass doors and approached the front desk. Her presence filled the room, drawing every eye as she set her briefcase on the counter. "I need to speak with whoever is in charge," she said, her voice steady and authoritative as she flashed her federal identification. "My name is Patricia Morales, Assistant Treasury Secretary. I'm here about Thomas Kinley." The words landed like a gavel, silencing the already hushed lobby. Patricia's calm was not the kind that soothed. It was the calm of somebody who wielded authority with precision, honed by 30 years in federal service. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her competence spoke louder than any shout. Janet stepped forward, her hands trembling despite her effort to appear composed. "Ma'am, I'm the branch manager, Janet Coleman. I've been managing this branch for 15 years. I wasn't aware of the situation until just now." Her voice wavered, betraying her nerves. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly, assessing Janet with a gaze that felt like it could see through walls. "And you are?" she prompted, her tone neutral but expectant. "Janet Coleman," Janet repeated, her throat tight. Patricia nodded, her movements deliberate as she opened her briefcase and retrieved a tablet in a thick folder brimming with documents. "Miss Coleman, I'm going to need to see your security footage from this morning's incident," she said, her words clipped and precise. "I also need to speak privately with the employee who made the decision to destroy Mr. Kinley's government-issued disability check." Haley, still standing behind the teller counter, felt her heart stop. Every pair of eyes in the bank turned to her, their stares pinning her in place. The reality of her actions crashed over her like a wave, cold and relentless. She had thought she was protecting the bank, but now she saw the truth. She had violated the trust of a man who had served his country, and the consequences were closing in around her. Outside, Thomas remained on the bench, his quiet presence a stark reminder of the human cost of her mistake. The black SUV loomed in the parking lot, a symbol of the reckoning that had just begun. The air in the bank felt thick with tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Haley Morrison stood behind the counter, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of the desk, her voice barely a whisper when she spoke. "That would be me," she said, the words fragile, like they might shatter if spoken too loudly. Her heart thudded in her chest, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the hum of the bank's fluorescent lights. She wasn't sure why this woman, Patricia, with her sharp suit and sharper gaze, had singled her out, but the weight of that stare made Haley feel like she was shrinking, her confidence evaporating with every passing second. Patricia Morales, Assistant Treasury Secretary, stood tall, her presence commanding the room without effort. She studied Haley's face for a long, agonizing moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she could see straight through to the young teller's racing thoughts. "Your name?" Patricia asked, her tone clipped but not unkind, though it carried an edge that made Haley's stomach twist. "Haley Morrison," she replied, her voice catching on the syllables. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself, but the room felt like it was tilting. She didn't know what she'd done wrong, not exactly, but the way Patricia was looking at her, like she'd committed some unforgivable sin, made her want to disappear. Patricia's expression didn't soften. "Miss Morrison, are you aware that deliberately destroying a veteran's disability compensation check is a federal offense under Title 38 of the United States Code?" Her words landed like a gavel, precise and heavy. Haley's face drained of color, her knees threatening to buckle. "No, ma'am," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know. I thought it might be fake." The excuse sounded pathetic even to her own ears, and she winced inwardly, replaying the moment she'd made the decision to tear up the check. It had seemed so straightforward at the time. Just a precaution, a way to protect the bank. Now, standing under Patricia's unrelenting scrutiny, she felt like a child caught in a lie. Did you attempt to verify the check through proper channels before destroying it? Patricia pressed, her tone measured but unrelenting. Did you call the VA verification hotline? Did you use the federal check authentication system your bank has access to? Did you consult with your supervisor before taking action? Each question was a blow, and Haley felt herself shrinking further with every one. Her mind scrambled for answers, but there were none. No, ma'am, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. She stared at her hands, knuckles white from gripping the counter, and wished she could rewind the morning, undo the moment she'd let her assumptions take over. She hadn't meant to cause trouble. She'd just been trying to do her job. But the weight of her mistake was settling over her like a suffocating blanket, and the shame burned hot in her chest. Patricia turned to Janet Coleman, the bank manager, who stood nearby, her face a mask of barely concealed dread. "Miss Coleman, I'm going to need to use your conference room," Patricia said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I'll need to speak with Ms. Morrison privately, and then I'll need to review your bank's compliance protocols with Federal Veteran Services regulations." Janet nodded quickly, her usual air of authority replaced by a nervous deference. "Of course. Right this way," she said, gesturing toward a hallway at the back of the bank. Her hands fidgeted as she led the way, her mind racing with thoughts of audits, fines, and the potential fallout for her branch. She'd trusted Haley to handle things, to follow protocol, but now she was kicking herself for not overseeing the situation more closely. What had seemed like a routine morning was spiraling into a nightmare. As they moved toward the conference room, Patricia paused at the large front window where Thomas Kinley sat outside on a bench, his weathered hands resting on the cane propped between his knees. The sight of him stirred something in Patricia, a mix of respect and quiet fury. She tapped gently on the glass, catching his attention, and gestured for him to come inside. Thomas looked up, his lined face registering surprise, then resignation. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, the cane bearing the weight of a body that had endured more than most could imagine. When Thomas stepped into the bank for the second time that morning, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The soft murmur of conversations fell silent. Tellers stood a little straighter, their hands pausing mid-task. Customers waiting in line instinctively stepped aside, sensing the gravity of the moment, though they couldn't quite place why. There was something about Thomas, his quiet dignity, the way he carried himself despite the tremble in his right hand and the limp in his step, that demanded respect. "Mr. Kinley," Patricia said, extending her hand with a warmth that contrasted with the steel in her voice moments earlier. "I'm Patricia Morales, Assistant Treasury Secretary. I'm here to address what happened to you this morning." Thomas shook her hand, his grip firm despite the tremor that betrayed the nerve damage he'd carried for decades. "Ma'am, I appreciate you coming, but this really isn't necessary," he said, his voice low and steady, tinged with the weariness of someone who'd long ago learned to expect little from the world. "I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding." Patricia's eyes softened, but her resolve didn't waver. "Sir, with respect, it absolutely is necessary," she said, her tone leaving no room for debate. "What happened to you this morning was not a misunderstanding. It was a violation of federal law and an insult to every person who has ever worn our nation's uniform." Her words were laced with a quiet intensity, a reflection of her deep-seated belief in the debt owed to those who had served. She guided Thomas to a chair near the conference room, her movements deliberate, ensuring he felt seen and valued. "Sir, before we proceed, I want you to know that this incident has been reported to the highest levels of the Veterans Administration and the Department of the Treasury. This is being taken very seriously." Thomas nodded, though his expression remained guarded. He wasn't used to people making a fuss over him. Years of navigating bureaucracy, of being dismissed or overlooked, had taught him to keep his expectations low. But as he settled into the chair, his thoughts drifted to the check, his lifeline, the small acknowledgement of the sacrifices he'd made. The sting of its destruction lingered, not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. He'd fought for that check, not just in the jungles of Vietnam, but in the years of recovery, the endless paperwork, the quiet battles to rebuild a life after war. To have it torn apart so carelessly felt like a betrayal, though he'd never say it aloud. Inside the conference room, Patricia sat across from Haley, with Janet present as a witness. The air was heavy with tension as Patricia placed a digital recorder on the table, its red light blinking like an unblinking eye. She opened Thomas's military service file on her tablet, her fingers moving with purpose. "Miss Morrison," she began, her voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I want you to understand exactly who you refused service to this morning." Haley stared at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, unable to meet Patricia's gaze. The shame was overwhelming now, a tidal wave that threatened to drown her. She'd acted on impulse, assuming the check was suspicious because of Thomas's appearance, his worn clothes, his trembling hand. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone, but the gravity of her mistake was becoming painfully clear. "Thomas Robert Kinley," Patricia continued, "Gunnery Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, served from 1967 to 1990, 3 combat tours in Vietnam, wounded twice, recipient of the Purple Heart, the Bronze Star with V device for valor, and the Silver Star for gallantry in action." Each word was a stone, building a monument to Thomas's service that Haley could feel looming over her. Sergeant Kinley spent 2 years in a military hospital recovering from injuries sustained while evacuating wounded Marines under enemy fire. His right hand trembles because of nerve damage from shrapnel. He walks with a cane because an IED in 1989 crushed his left knee during his final deployment. Haley's throat tightened, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She wanted to disappear, to erase the moment she'd made her snap judgment. She hadn't known. How could she have known? But the truth was she hadn't asked. She hadn't checked. She'd just assumed, and now the weight of that assumption was crushing her. Patricia's voice remained steady, but her words carried a quiet fury. "The check you destroyed this morning represents compensation for disabilities he sustained while serving our country. It's not charity. It's not welfare. It's payment for services rendered and sacrifices made." She turned to Janet, who sat rigid, her face pale. "Miss Coleman, your employee made several critical errors this morning. First, she failed to follow federal verification procedures for government checks. Second, she destroyed official government property. Third, she violated the Service Member Civil Relief Act by discriminating against a veteran. Fourth, she caused emotional distress to a protected class individual." Janet nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. She felt the weight of her own failure as a manager, the sting of knowing she'd let this happen under her watch. What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, dreading the answer. Patricia closed the file with a deliberate motion, her eyes locking onto Haley's. "Ms. Morrison," she said, her tone unwavering, "your actions today have consequences. We'll need to discuss those in detail, and I'll need a full account of what happened from your perspective. But first, I want you to understand the gravity of what you've done, not just to Mr. Kinley, but to the trust that veterans place in institutions like this one." Haley nodded, her vision blurring with tears she couldn't hold back any longer. She felt small, exposed, her mistake laid bare for all to see. Outside the conference room, Thomas sat quietly, his hands resting on his cane, his thoughts a mix of resignation and quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, this time someone would make things right. The conference room was stark, its fluorescent lights casting a cold glow over the polished table. Haley Morrison sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as the weight of Patricia Morales' words crashed over her like a tidal wave. "Your employment with this bank is terminated, effective immediately," Patricia declared, her voice steady but laced with an unmistakable edge of authority. "You are ineligible for rehire at any federally insured financial institution. This incident will be reported to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and will remain a permanent mark on your employment record." Haley's chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. Tears welled up, spilling over before she could stop them. Her voice trembled as she stammered, "Please, I didn't know. I was just trying to do my job." The words felt hollow even as they left her lips, a desperate plea that crumbled under the scrutiny of the moment. She thought back to that fleeting decision at the teller counter, the torn check, the impatience that had flared within her. It had seemed so trivial then, a quick act to assert control in a busy day. Now it was the unraveling of her entire world. Shame burned in her chest, mingling with fear of what this meant for her future. Patricia's gaze didn't soften. She leaned forward slightly, her tone firm yet measured. Your job, Ms. Morrison, was to treat every customer with respect and to adhere to federal regulations. You failed on both counts. The words weren't cruel, but they cut deeply, each one a reminder of the responsibility Haley had neglected. Patricia rose, her movements deliberate, and opened the conference room door. Miss Coleman, she called to Janet Coleman, the branch manager, who stood just outside, her face pale with unease. I need you to process Mr. Kinley's check immediately and draft a formal written apology from this institution. Additionally, prepare to review your employee training protocols with federal auditors arriving next week. Janet nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Inside, she churned with a mix of guilt and frustration. As the branch manager, she prided herself on running a tight ship, but this incident had exposed cracks in her oversight. She replayed the moment in her mind. Haley's rash action, the torn check fluttering to the counter, Thomas Kinley's quiet dignity in the face of humiliation. How had she missed the signs that her staff needed better training? The thought of federal auditors scrutinizing her branch made her stomach knot, but she resolved to face it head-on. She owed that much to Mr. Kinley. In the main lobby, Thomas Kinley sat on a cushioned bench, his weathered hands clutching the fragments of his disability check. At 74, his body bore the scars of a lifetime of service, aching joints, a limp from an old injury, the weight of memories from his years as a Marine sergeant. His eyes, tired but kind, stared at the torn pieces, each one a small betrayal. He didn't want to be here, didn't want to be the center of this storm. All he'd wanted was to cash his check, to cover his modest bills, to keep moving forward as he always had. The humiliation stung, but worse was the pity he saw in the eyes of other customers that day. He'd spent his life standing tall. Now he felt small. Patricia approached him, her heels clicking softly on the tiled floor. She knelt slightly to meet his gaze, her expression warm yet resolute. Mr. Kinley, the employee who mistreated you has been terminated. The bank will process your check immediately and provide a formal apology. But more than that, I want you to know, this incident will lead to improved training for bank employees across the region. Her voice carried a sincerity that made Thomas look up, his tired eyes searching hers. He shook his head slowly, his voice low and gravelly. Ma'am, I don't want anyone losing their job over me. The words came from a place of deep compassion, forged through decades of sacrifice. He'd seen enough loss in his life, comrades, opportunities, health. The thought of a young woman's livelihood crumbling because of him felt like another wound. Patricia's expression softened, but her resolve didn't waver. Sir, she didn't lose her job because of you. She lost it because she forgot that respect isn't optional, especially for those who've served our country. She handed him a new check, freshly validated and stamped, its crisp edges a stark contrast to the torn pieces he still held. This has been expedited through federal channels. I assure you, this will never happen again. Thomas took the check, his fingers brushing against hers. He nodded, a quiet acknowledgement, but his heart remained heavy. He didn't want apologies or promises. He just wanted to be seen as a man, not a symbol of someone else's mistake. As Patricia prepared to leave, she turned to address the entire lobby, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. Customers paused, tellers looked up, and even Marcus Williams, the bank's security guard and an Army veteran himself, stood a little straighter. Let me make one thing perfectly clear, she said, her tone unwavering. Veterans' rights are not suggestions. They are federal law, and they will be enforced. The words hung in the air, a solemn vow that left no room for doubt. Marcus felt a swell of pride, tempered by a pang of regret. He'd been there that day, watching silently as Haley tore the check. He should have stepped in, should have said something. The memory gnawed at him, a reminder of his own duty to protect those like Thomas. The bank reopened the following Monday, transformed in subtle but profound ways. Behind the main counter, a framed photograph now hung prominently, a young Thomas Kinley in his Marine dress blues, circa 1970, standing at attention with a fierce pride in his eyes. Below it, a plaque read, "For those who served but never asked to be remembered." The image was a quiet tribute, but it spoke volumes to everyone who passed by. Sarah Chen, the new head teller, stood at the counter with a calm authority. As the daughter of a Vietnam veteran, she carried her father's stories of sacrifice and resilience in her heart. Selected personally by the regional manager, Sarah was determined to ensure no veteran would ever face disrespect in this bank again. Her first directive was simple but firm. If anyone has ever worn a uniform, they go to the front of the line. The policy was met with quiet approval from customers, who seemed to sense the weight of its intent. Sarah's thoughts often drifted to her father, whose own struggles with bureaucracy after the war had shaped her sense of justice. This was her chance to honor him, and men like Thomas. That Monday, a woman approached the counter, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She was the same customer who had stood in line during Thomas's ordeal, silently witnessing his humiliation. Guilt had haunted her since that day, her inaction a heavy burden. She placed $50 on the counter, her voice trembling. "This is for Mr. Kinley. I should have spoken up that day. I should have stood up for him." Sarah's heart ached at the woman's words. She accepted the money with a gentle smile. "Ma'am, would you like to give this to him personally? He comes in every month." The woman's face lit up with a mix of relief and gratitude. "I'd like that very much," she whispered. Over the weekend, the incident had spread like wildfire across social media. A local news station picked up the story, focusing not on Haley's firing, but on Thomas's quiet dignity. A customer's shaky phone video had captured the moment, Thomas calmly gathering the pieces of his torn check, speaking respectfully to Haley despite her actions, and walking away without a trace of anger. The footage struck a chord, drawing comments from across the country. "This is what honor looks like," one user wrote. "My grandfather was a Marine. This breaks my heart," said another. A bank manager in Ohio commented, "We're using this story to train our employees about respect." The outpouring of support was overwhelming, a testament to the quiet power of Thomas's response. But the most unexpected response came 3 days after the incident. Haley Morrison sat in her small apartment, her face bare of makeup, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She stared into her phone's camera, her voice raw as she recorded a video. "I need to say something," she began, her words heavy with regret. She spoke of her mistake, the weight of her actions, and the lesson she'd learned too late. It was a moment of vulnerability, a step toward accountability, though she knew it couldn't undo the past. Her heart raced as she posted the video, unsure of how it would be received, but certain she had to try. The weight of regret pressed heavily on Haley Morrison's chest as she reflected on that fateful day at the bank. She had been utterly, unforgivably wrong. Her actions, born from a fleeting moment of frustration, had shattered something far more valuable than she could have imagined. She had destroyed a check belonging to a man who had served their country with unwavering courage, a man who had borne the scars of his sacrifices for the freedom she took for granted. And why? Because her day had been rough, her patience frayed, and she had unleashed her bitterness on someone who deserved nothing but respect. The realization gnawed at her, a relentless ache that refused to fade. Haley sat alone in her small apartment, her eyes tracing the lines of a service record she had found online about Sergeant Thomas Kinley. Each word deepened her shame. He was a decorated Marine, wounded multiple times in battles that ensured her safety, yet she had treated him like a common fraud. Her mind replayed the moment, his quiet dignity as she tore his check, her sharp words dismissing his explanation, the flicker of hurt in his eyes that she had been too self-absorbed to notice. She had robbed him of more than money. She had stripped him of the respect he had earned through blood and sacrifice. Tears welled up as she whispered to herself, "I can't take it back." But the weight of her mistake demanded she try. The incident had not gone unnoticed. A security camera captured the exchange, and the video spread across the internet like wildfire. Yet it wasn't Haley's error that captivated viewers. It was her raw, unfiltered remorse in a follow-up apology video. Her voice had trembled as she admitted her fault, her face etched with the pain of self-awareness. People saw themselves in her vulnerability, recognizing their own capacity for hasty judgments and regrettable actions. The video resonated not because it shamed Haley, but because it held a mirror to humanity's shared imperfections. Thomas Kinley, the man at the heart of the ordeal, saw the video too. From his modest home, he watched Haley's tearful confession, his heart stirred by her sincerity. He felt no anger, only a quiet resolve to respond with the grace that had defined his life. He picked up the phone and called the bank, asking for Haley's contact information. Sarah, the bank manager, gently explained that privacy policies prevented her from sharing personal details. Undeterred, Thomas left a message, his voice steady but warm. "Please tell Miss Morrison that I forgive her. Everyone deserves a second chance. I hope she finds peace." When Sarah relayed the message, Haley collapsed into a chair, overcome by emotion. The kindness of the man she had wronged pierced her heart more deeply than any reprimand could have. His forgiveness was a gift she felt unworthy of, yet it ignited a spark of hope within her. She vowed to carry his grace forward, to transform her mistake into something meaningful. A month later, Haley found herself in a new role at a veteran services organization. The job paid far less than her banking position, but the satisfaction it brought filled a void she hadn't known existed. Each day, she helped former military personnel navigate complex benefit systems, her empathy deepened by her own experience. "I can't undo what I did," she confided to her supervisor, her voice tinged with determination. "But I can make sure no one else feels dismissed the way I made Sergeant Kinley feel." Her work became a quiet penance, a way to honor the man who had shown her mercy. The ripples of that single moment at a small Texas bank extended far beyond its walls. The incident prompted federal guidelines to be revised, ensuring better protections for veterans. Training programs were overhauled, emphasizing the importance of respect for those who had served. A renewed awareness took root, reminding people that veterans' sacrifices deserved recognition, not skepticism. But the most profound lesson was simpler, yet harder to grasp. Dignity is not a privilege to be earned or a trophy to be displayed. It is a fundamental right, one that should never be questioned or defended. For Thomas Kinley, that torn check had represented more than a monthly disability payment. It was a tangible acknowledgement of his service, a reminder that his country valued the years he had given, the wounds he had endured, the comrades he had lost. He didn't seek hero worship or grand gestures. All he wanted was to be seen, not as a number, not as a potential scammer, but as a human being worthy of basic courtesy. When that courtesy was denied, the response was not vengeance, but a quiet, powerful justice that arrived precisely when it was needed. 6 months later, Thomas continued his monthly visits to the bank. Now the staff greeted him by name, their smiles genuine, their service marked by respect. A photograph hung on the wall, not as a monument to anyone's shame or triumph, but as a quiet reminder: the person standing before you carries a story you may never know, sacrifices you cannot fathom, and a dignity you have no right to challenge. Thomas moved through these moments with the same humility that had always defined him, asking for no special treatment, expecting no applause. He carried the quiet certainty that when dignity is threatened, there are still those who will stand and say, "This is not acceptable." Haley Morrison's life had transformed in ways she never anticipated. She became one of Texas's most dedicated veterans advocates, her work driven by a lesson no manual could teach: the profound weight of dismissing someone's service. She never forgot Thomas's forgiveness, a gift that reshaped her understanding of honor. It wasn't diminished by others' actions, but defined by how one responds to mistreatment. Her mistake had revealed her flaws, but his grace had shown her who she could become. The black SUV that had once lingered outside the bank, perhaps a symbol of oversight or consequence, never returned. It didn't need to. The message had been delivered, absorbed, and woven into a system that now served its people with greater care. Thomas Kinley continued his quiet life, unassuming yet resolute, a man who needed no fanfare to know his worth. He lived with the knowledge that some battles are won not with fury, but with the steady, unyielding belief that justice will always find its way, arriving exactly when it is meant to.